Picture the most calculated, most patient, most terrifyingly intelligent mind that ever existed outside the divine, coiled in shadow at the edge of a garden so impossibly perfect that even the air inside it smells like something no human language has a word for. He's been preparing for this moment since before time decided to start counting. He has studied the architecture of desire, mapped the geography of doubt, and rehearsed every syllable of every whisper he plans to deploy with surgical precision against two beings who have never in their brief existence had a reason to distrust anything. He is not nervous. Nervousness is for creatures with something to lose, and this being, the morning star, the great adversary, the one who once stood at the right hand of everything and chose to walk away, believes with absolute certainty that this moment belongs to him. The serpent moves. The words are chosen. The logic is airtight, wrapped in just enough truth to be lethal, just enough beauty to be irresistible, just enough philosophical weight to make a curious mind stop and wonder. He has done everything right, and there is no version of this moment in his mind where he does not win, and then imagine that he doesn't. Not because he made a mistake, not because his argument had a flaw, but because in this alternate timeline, this quiet, unremarkable, history-shattering fork in the road of all reality, something in the human heart chooses differently. A pause, a look, a moment of clarity so small it would be invisible from the outside, and so enormous in consequence that it reorders everything that was ever supposed to come after. The hand that was reaching stops, and the fruit stays on the tree. The serpent retreats. No victory cry, no cosmic ripple of corruption spreading outward, just silence and a garden that remains exactly what it was designed to be, whole, untouched, breathing in the quiet confidence of a world that just impossibly chose not to break. And somewhere in the unseen architecture of the spiritual realm, on the wrong side of a boundary he cannot cross, the greatest adversary in existence stands in a silence so complete it is louder than any war he has ever fought, because he has just encountered the one scenario he never, in all his millennia of plotting, thought to plan for. He failed, and the world kept going. And here is the question that should already be making you uncomfortable. Not what happens to humanity without sin, because that part is almost painfully obvious, but what happens to him? What becomes of the being whose entire identity, whose entire purpose, whose entire reason for existing in opposition to the divine order is built on the assumption that humanity will fall? What does the adversary do when there is nothing left to be adverse to? What does the destroyer do in a world that refuses to be destroyed? What does the tempter do when every temptation finds no purchase, slides off clean, leaves no mark, and the garden simply continues existing in its unbearable, infuriating, perfect integrity? This is the Lucifer Paradox, one of the most unsettling, most philosophically explosive thought experiments you will ever walk through, because the answer it produces is not what anyone expects, and it will change the way you think about power and purpose long after this video ends. We are not doing theology today. We are entering a version of history so strange, it feels illegal to imagine. A world where Eden never fell, where the greatest adversary is denied the one thing he organized his entire existence around, and becomes something far more terrifying than a destroyer. He becomes irrelevant. And for a being of his pride, irrelevance is a suffering that no fire in any version of hell could come close to matching. We are pulling the one thread that was never supposed to be pulled, watching the entire tapestry unravel in ways that are fascinating, disturbing, and at certain moments, genuinely, uncomfortably funny. If you are not subscribed yet, this is your moment, because where we are going gets considerably stranger, and you will absolutely not want to arrive late. Before we go deeper into what Satan becomes in a sinless world, we need to understand exactly what he loses. Because the Lucifer Paradox only hits with its full force when you truly comprehend the scale of what the fall of man was supposed to mean for him. Not just spiritually, not just symbolically, but strategically, in the way a chess grandmaster understands what it means to lose the piece that the entire game was built around. In the traditional narrative, Lucifer's rebellion in heaven is Act 1 of a drama always written to arrive at a specific destination. He falls. He absorbs the impact, recalibrates, and immediately begins looking for leverage. What he finds, what becomes the centerpiece of his entire post-rebellion strategy, is the newly created human race, specifically the garden, specifically the two beings inside it who carry the one thing that makes them both infinitely valuable and infinitely exploitable: free will. Because free will, properly manipulated, is not just a weakness, it is a weapon. And Satan, more than any being in creation, understands how to turn the gifts of the divine against the one who gave them. The corruption of Adam and Eve is not a random act of malice. It is a carefully constructed legal and philosophical argument made in real time, in flesh and consequence. His argument, the one he has been building since the moment of his own fall, is essentially this: free will is a flaw in the design. Given the choice, creation will always choose corruption. God's trust in his beloved creation is naive at best and catastrophically misplaced at worst. The fall of man is supposed to be the evidence, submitted to the court of the universe, that proves his case beyond any reasonable doubt. Think about what that means in practical terms. Every act of human cruelty across thousands of years becomes a point on his scoreboard. Every war, every betrayal, every moment where a human being looked at another and chose violence or greed or deception, all of it is, from his perspective, vindication. He didn't just corrupt two people in a garden, he opened a door, and for millennia, humanity kept walking through it voluntarily, with full knowledge of the consequences. Exactly what he predicted, exactly what he promised, and exactly what he needed. To justify the entirety of his rebellion, now remove the fall entirely, not just the consequences, the event itself. The door was never opened. The corruption never took root. The argument was never submitted because the evidence never materialized. And Satan stands in this alternate timeline, not just defeated in a single moment, but stripped of the entire architecture of his post-rebellion existence: the leverage, the legal standing, the philosophical argument, the centuries of vindication. All of it gone because a hand stopped reaching for a piece of fruit on an afternoon in a garden that will now remain forever perfect. Here is where the paradox gets genuinely uncomfortable, because a being like Satan doesn't respond to defeat the way a human being would. He doesn't grieve. He recalibrates, circles back, tries different angles with the patience of an entity for whom time is not a pressure, but a resource. He is methodical. He is relentless. And none of it works, because in this timeline, the sinless world has no structural weakness he can locate, no point of entry he can force, no crack in the human heart he can widen, because the crack was never opened by the first transgression. He is a general who arrived at the battlefield fully armed, perfectly prepared, with a plan that took millennia to construct, and found no enemy, no terrain to fight on, and no war to wage. And what happens to a general in that situation is far more psychologically devastating than any defeat on an actual battlefield, because at least a battlefield defeat means the fight was real. This is something else entirely. This is the discovery that the fight he prepared for was never going to happen, and that the universe moved on without him so completely, so effortlessly, that his absence barely registered as a footnote in the story it was telling without him. Power, real power, the kind that moves history and reshapes the moral landscape of civilizations, needs resistance to function. You cannot be a force of corruption where there is no corrupted matter to work with. You cannot be a tempter in a reality where the first temptation failed and left no foothold for any that follow. You cannot be the adversary of something that your adversarial energy simply slides off of, finds no grip on, leaves no mark. And in a sinless world, in this pristine, breathtakingly intact alternate Eden, that is exactly the situation Satan finds himself locked inside of for what begins to feel, even to an eternal being, like an unbearably long time. The early phase of his response to the failure is probably the most recognizable, methodical, driven by the certainty that no single failure defines the campaign. He identifies new angles. He watches the humans with obsessive attention, looking for the moment when curiosity sharpens into something exploitable, when the dynamic between the couple shifts in a way that creates an opening. He is a master of reading the interior landscape of free beings, and he knows that even the most innocent mind has corners that can be turned toward shadow with the right kind of light applied at the right angle. Except that in this timeline, the corners never quite appear. The couple's relationship remains so thoroughly, so consistently, so almost frustratingly whole, that every angle he identifies closes before he can move into it. Not because the humans are invulnerable. Free will is still real, still theoretically capable of choosing otherwise, but because without the first transgression having already occurred, without the inherited brokenness that in the original timeline makes humans structurally predisposed to certain kinds of darkness, the soil he needs simply does not exist. He is trying to plant seeds in bedrock. He is trying to start a fire in a room where oxygen itself has sided with the opposition. As weeks become months and months accumulate into years, Satan begins to encounter an experience that nothing in his existence has prepared him for. He begins to encounter irrelevance, not the dramatic, contested irrelevance of a defeated general who still commands respect from enemies who beat him, but the quiet, devastating, almost administrative irrelevance of a being who has been simply overlooked by a world that found no reason to need him. The humans don't know his name. This sounds like a small thing until you really sit with it, because this is a being whose identity is entirely constructed around his role as the Great Adversary, the one against whom all of creation must choose, the presence that gives moral choice its weight and urgency and drama. Without his influence having shaped anything, he is not feared, not resisted, not prayed against, not warned about. He is simply absent from the story in a way that is almost worse than being villainized. Being the villain, at least, means you are acknowledged. The narrative needs you, makes space for you, builds tension around your presence. But in this alternate timeline, in this sinless world that keeps flourishing without ever developing the spiritual emergency that would make Satan's existence relevant, he is not the villain. He is not anything. He is a name no one knows, attached to a story no one is telling, haunting the edges of a world that has absolutely no idea what haunting even means. And the world that grows without him is not diminished by his absence. It is not less dramatic, not less meaningful, not less rich in its depth and complexity. It is, if anything, more. The full expression of what creation was designed to be. Before the adversary introduced the darkness that in the original timeline became so woven into the human story that we find it almost impossible to imagine meaning without suffering. And that discovery, that the world is better without him and continues forward without even glancing back, is the beginning of the end of everything Satan thought he was. Let's talk about what Satan actually does with himself on a Tuesday in a sinless world, because this is where the Lucifer Paradox abandons all pretense of being a purely philosophical exercise and reveals itself to be, among other things, one of the darkest comedies ever accidentally constructed by the collision of theology and speculative fiction. And I mean that with complete sincerity, because the picture that emerges when you trace his daily existence in this alternate timeline is so profoundly, painfully absurd that laughing at it feels not just appropriate but necessary. He wakes up, if an eternal being can be said to wake, to the same situation he went to sleep inside of, a world doing phenomenally well without him. He checks the garden, still perfect. He scans the human population, still joyful, still connected, still building lives of such effortless wholeness that it is metaphysically painful to watch. He runs through the list of approaches he has not yet tried and finds it, getting shorter in ways that suggest he is running out of creative options. So what does the greatest ego in creation actually do with this situation? This is Lucifer, the most beautiful being ever created by most traditional accounts, the most gifted, the one who stood in the full light of the divine and was considered so extraordinary that his fall was treated as a cosmic tragedy. This is not a being built for obscurity, and this is not a personality type that responds well to being ignored. His ego is not just large, it is the structural foundation of everything he is, and it has just been placed in a reality that is systematically, cheerfully undermining it at every possible level. Picture him trying to tempt animals, because at this point, what else is he doing? And discovering that animals in a world that never experienced the fall have no particular capacity for malice. They are just animals. They eat, sleep, and exist in their uncomplicated way, and they have absolutely no interest in being recruited into a rebellion against a cosmic order they have never been given a reason to resent. He whispers to a bird. The bird flies away. He whispers to a lion. The lion yawns in a direction that suggests it has better things to contemplate. He attempts to find anywhere in the natural world any creature that carries even the faint ancestral memory of the darkness that in the original timeline worked its way through the entire ecosystem, and finds nothing, because the darkness was never seeded here. So he shifts strategies. He turns his attention toward the structural weaknesses of the divine order itself, looking for a legal angle, a cosmic loophole, some technicality in the architecture of reality he might exploit, to re-enter the story from a direction he hasn't tried. This, at least, feels like him. This feels like the strategic brilliance that made him dangerous in the first place. And he finds nothing, not because the rules are impenetrable in principle, but because every door he identifies doesn't have a keyhole, because the room it would have led to was never built, because the fall that would have created the need for that room never happened. He is, at this point, the cosmic equivalent of a highly specialized professional whose entire field of expertise has ceased to exist. A locksmith in a world where locks were never invented. A firefighter in a city that has never discovered fire. His skills are real. His intelligence is real. His power is real. And none of it has any application in this context, which is the specific flavor of existential horror that the sinless world reserves exclusively for the being who was supposed to be its great nemesis, and who has instead become its most baffling, most darkly hilarious uninvited guest, standing permanently outside the party, unable to enter, unable to leave, and slowly running out of things to do with his hands. And then, right when the absurdity seems to have reached its satirical peak, something inside him shifts, something deep and quiet and entirely unexpected. And it is not funny at all. The shift begins the way all truly significant internal changes begin, not with a dramatic revelation, not with an obvious crisis, but with something so small it would be easy to miss. A specific, unremarkable detail in the life of the humans he has been watching. One interaction, one ordinary afternoon in a world that has no extraordinary suffering to interrupt it, that lands differently than everything else he has observed, and he cannot immediately explain why. Maybe it is the way they laugh, not at something, not in the pointed, slightly desperate way that laughter functions in a world that needs relief from pain, but just because the moment is good, and the moment being good is enough, and there is nothing anywhere in their reality requiring them to manufacture joy as a defense against something darker. It is laughter that has no shadow behind it. Laughter that has never learned to be a coping mechanism because coping was never required. And something about it, on this unremarkable afternoon, hits him in a place he did not know was still capable of being hit. Because here is the truth the Lucifer Paradox has been building toward, and it lands hardest not in philosophical analysis, but in the specific, embodied, completely unexpected moment of recognition. He is watching the version of humanity that was always possible. He is watching what creation was designed to produce when left intact. He is watching the proof, not theoretical, not argued, but lived daily in the faces of beings who have never had a reason to doubt whether the world is fundamentally good. That his rebellion was not just a strategic failure, it was a mistake. The deepest kind of mistake, the kind where you chose the wrong thing not out of ignorance but out of pride, and then spent eternity constructing elaborate justifications for why the wrong choice was actually the only rational option. Theologians debate whether a being like Satan is capable of something like regret, and in the standard narrative the question is almost irrelevant because he at least has the satisfaction of his victory. The fall happened. His argument has real-world evidence. But in this timeline, stripped of every defense, stripped of the victory that in the original world gives his rebellion a kind of terrible meaning, he has nothing between himself and the full weight of what he chose, what it cost, and what it was actually for. His original argument, the one he staked everything on, left heaven for, fell for, was that free will is a design flaw, that given the choice creation chooses corruption, and that the trust placed in free beings by the divine order is naive and will collapse under the weight of its own idealism. This was the defining claim of his existence, the intellectual foundation of his rebellion, the thing that made the fall of man not just a tactical victory, but a validation of everything he had argued and sacrificed to demonstrate. And the sinless world refutes it, not aggressively, not with a counter-argument, just by existing, free beings choosing again and again with no coercion to stay whole, to stay good, not because goodness was mandated, but because left genuinely free and unmolested by the corruption he introduced, goodness is what creation tends toward, almost inevitably, which means his entire argument that corruption was always coming, that he was just the instrument of an unavoidable truth, was wrong. Wrong about free will, wrong about creation, wrong about everything he chose to believe. He cannot leave. He cannot stop watching. He cannot unfeel what the watching is producing in him, because an eternal being has no mechanism for forgetting and no escape from really understanding, in whatever passes for bones in a spiritual being of his order, that the story he told himself about why his rebellion was necessary and right was, in this timeline, always going to end in silence. The quiet, devastating silence of a world that never needed his interference to find its own answer, and found it, and kept going, without ever looking back. The silence does not roar. It simply is, and it is the loudest thing he has ever heard. And so we arrive at the end of the Lucifer Paradox, not with fire, not with chains, not with the theatrical grandeur that centuries of religious imagination built around divine punishment, but with something far quieter, far stranger, and far more devastating than any punishment designed to break this specific being. We arrive at a world that is simply, completely, serenely fine without him. And for the morning star, that is not just a punishment. It is the punishment, the one that fits the crime with a precision that could only be called intentional. Think about what we have traced across this thought experiment. We started with the most dangerous, most strategically brilliant adversarial force in history, preparing for the moment that was supposed to validate everything. We watched that moment fail. We watched him recalibrate, retry, exhaust every angle, shift into something that looked increasingly like a cosmic joke with no punchline, a figure of enormous power becoming progressively a figure of enormous futility. We watched the absurdity accumulate until it stopped being funny and started being painful. And then we watched the final weight of the paradox arrive as a quiet, private reckoning with the truth that all of it was built on an assumption this alternate history disproves without even trying. What does that add up to? The most complete hell imaginable for the adversary is not suffering. It is the absence of impact. It is the discovery that the universe does not require you, does not improve in your presence, does not diminish in your absence, and does not remember your name. It is the discovery that the story was always going to be good without you, and that your entire existence was, in the most fundamental possible way, a choice that didn't have to happen, built on an argument that was never true, and validated by a corruption you introduced into a world that would have been generationally better without you having ever entered it. For a being of Lucifer's pride, whose self-image is the literal foundation of everything he is, this is not just defeat. It is annihilation that leaves the body intact and destroys everything else. You can survive punishment because suffering has a dignity to it. It confirms you mattered enough to be punished. But being overlooked, being the cosmic afterthought in a story that found its perfect resolution without ever acknowledging you, is something a being of his particular construction was never built to survive. The garden stands. The couple lives. The generations that follow carry no inherited brokenness, no spiritual fractures, no complicated moral landscape created by the darkness that was supposed to be his gift to the species. They are whole, they know it, and they live from that wholeness in ways that create a human history so different from the one we know it would be almost unrecognizable, and so extraordinary in its beauty that it functions as both the heaven for those inside it and the most perfectly targeted punishment for the one eternal being forced to observe it from outside forever. That is the Lucifer Paradox. The answer to the question we started with is not a battle, not a confrontation, not a dramatic reversal of cosmic fortune. The answer is a garden, just a garden, staying exactly what it was always supposed to be. And the adversary, watching it through a boundary he cannot cross, from a position of absolute irrelevance, forced to witness the refutation of everything he chose to believe, discovers in the most complete silence of his eternal existence that the perfect world does not create a paradise for everyone inside it. For the one being locked forever on the outside of its perfection, the perfect world builds something else entirely. The most precise, the most personal, the most inescapable hell in the history of everything. Share this video with someone who thinks the devil always wins, and let the paradox do what it does best. make you question every assumption you ever made about power, purpose, and what it really costs to be wrong about the nature of creation itself. We will see you in the next one, and it goes even deeper than this.